Hi guys, quick lecture this week on language variation, Acmagian chapter 7. And you'll see we're jumping over the semantics chapter. Straight on to basically the next section of the book. Rather than staying on theory, we're now talking about the application of theory that we've been seeing for the first two-thirds or so of the course. And you may also have been asked to watch a video, or possibly two. These are central to the message of this unit, and I would strongly recommend that you watch them because they inform a great deal of what I'll be talking about in this lecture. Now, what do we mean by language variation? Well, let's bring things back one step and remind ourselves that, for instance, all European languages, with the exception of three or four, are related. They're all cousins. French is related to Russian, is related to Spanish, is related to Greek. And it may surprise you that European languages are, or at least the Indo-European group, as it's called, also includes languages like Persian, spoken in Iran, and Hindi, spoken in India. These are all part of the same language group. But over the thousands of years that the Indo-European language group, that Indo-European languages have been spoken, they've grown apart. They've become separated by rivers and mountain ranges. However, you can still recognize that, for instance, if you count, that these languages are related. English, 1, 2, 3. French, 1, 2, 3. German, 1, 2, 3. Irish, 1, 2, 3. You can see they're in the same language family. Are they dialects? Not anymore. But let's narrow it down. Let's say, to the Romance group. Are Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, and French dialects of the same entity? Well, it depends. As the text points out in a few pages, speakers of Brazilian Portuguese seem to be able to understand the Spanish spoken in countries around South America. There's a certain amount of intelligibility in these languages. Same with the Germanic language group. English, Dutch, German, Frisian, these are all related. And then you have, of course, those are the West Germanic languages, but you have the North Germanic languages spoken in Scandinavia, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian. These are so closely related that speakers of Swedish and Danish, for instance, or Swedish and Norwegian, might be able to a certain extent to communicate with each other. Let's just say right now that dialect is dialects are mutually intelligible variants of the same language. Now, all too often we'll judge other dialects as poor or bad. For decades, people have viewed African American English as bad, for instance. They say, where's the verb to be when an African American says he's sleeping? It ought to be there. While forgetting that speakers of English very often drop the verb to be themselves. You will hear ordinary speakers of English saying quite happily to each other, "You happy?" Where's the verb to be there? So I think we can say that while we like to believe in the existence of standardized central dialects that are somehow better than others, there is in fact no dialect of any language that is better than any other. People from Ohio or Indiana might claim that theirs is the best English. They might claim that this is a central dialect of English and is understandable all over. But the truth is, it's no more or less intelligible than the English of any other place. I've never met Australians and Texans who weren't able to communicate with each other. I've never met Scots and Bostonians who weren't able to communicate with each other. And yet we persist in the belief that, let's say, the working class dialect of New Jersey is somehow flawed or inferior, or African American English is inferior, or Hispanic English is inferior, or Appalachian English is inferior. It's just not the case. Okay, there are three, maybe even a fourth ways in which we distinguish language variation. The first is geographical. Speakers in the UK speak a different variety of English from that spoken in the United States. Geography. The second might be class. Rich, educated residents of New Jersey's suburbs maybe speak different English than poorly educated urban residents. Maybe. Race and culture. White people speak differently from African Americans. More controversially, well, it's not so controversial anymore. Books have been published on the matter. Women and men. Can we use gender as a marker? It's possible. All right. Now, I'm not really going to touch very much on the idea of forensic linguistics, but if you're interested in law enforcement, you should be known that sometimes linguists are consulted if there's an argument about the authenticity of a telephone call or a will or whatever it might be. Did John Smith really make that call, send that text, write that will, write that letter? And linguists might analyze whatever it is to see if the document in question or the transcript in question reflects the linguistic tics or features of the person it's purported to be from. That is to say, we all use words in our own individual way. And for that reason, we use the word idiolect, which simply means self-dialect. I have my own way of speaking. You, as an individual, have your way of speaking. Donald Trump has his way of speaking. Boris Johnson has his. Everybody has their own individual way of speaking, inside, of course, their own dialect. Okay. Now, we spoke a little about intelligibility. People claim it was Oscar Wilde said this. I'm not sure who it was, in fact. Language is spoken by people who have their own government and navy. A dialect is spoken by people who don't. I quite like that idea. I saw last week in the bookstore an American dictionary. The publishers, who were well known, were claiming that the English language was actually the American language. It's an interesting shift. Now, I'm inclined to agree with what the text points out here. If you have two speakers of two varieties of the same language who can understand each other, those varieties are simply dialects. If they become mutually unintelligible, perhaps we're speaking about new languages. There's an ongoing controversy about Scottish varieties of English. Are they far enough away from other dialects that they are unintelligible and therefore a new language? I won't go into that at this stage. It's too controversial. Page 277 of Ackmagion asks and fudges the answer. Are Mandarin and Chinese dialects or different languages? Now, Chinese has the same writing system, whether you're speaking Mandarin or Cantonese. I said Chinese instead of Cantonese, I think. Whether you're speaking Mandarin or Cantonese, or any other variety of Chinese. But while the two varieties are descended from the same language, they're far enough apart that a speaker of Mandarin has almost no chance of being understood by a speaker of Cantonese, or vice versa. Are they dialects? Are they separate languages? It's hard to say, particularly because the Chinese written language bridges the gap. You remember, it's not an alphabetical language. Chinese represents words or concepts when it's written down. So it's entirely possible to have the same text pronounced in two completely different ways by speakers. Then there are the two languages, Tohono O'odham and Akimel O'odham, one of which is spoken in Arizona and another of which is spoken across the border in northern Mexico. Now, to all intents and purposes, they sound, look, and behave exactly alike, but because of that border and because of identity controversies, both communities, the speakers of the language, depending on what side of the border they're on, say the other crowd speak a different language. Now, you're probably not old enough to remember the existence of Yugoslavia. It broke up about 25 years ago, but until then, the central language of Yugoslavia was Serbo-Croat, and it was widely spoken, particularly in Serbia and Croatia. Now, after the country broke up, Croatians began to insist that they had their own language, Croatian, and Serbians began to insist that they had their own language, Serbian. But in fact, both languages are pretty much the same thing. The only major difference is Croatians use the Roman alphabet and Serbians use the Cyrillic, but the vocabulary is the same, the grammar is the same. But they have cultural and political reasons to declare their languages different from each other. Now, let's jump on to dialects of the same language and use an example of English. On page 278, there's a fascinating postage stamp introduction to a major study that a famous linguist, William Labov, did in the late 60s, early 70s of English, and particularly the way R's are pronounced at the end of a word in New York English. And Labov began to recognize that you were more likely to pronounce an R if you were in a lower social class. in New York than you were if you were in an upper class, which is to say, sorry, I meant to put that the other way around. You were more likely to drop your R's in New York if you were in a lower class, and pronounce your R's if you were in an upper class. So he decided he would test this. So he identified 3 department stores, one high class, Saks Fifth Avenue, one middle level, Macy's, and another, S. Klein, considered low class. And in each, he went in and asked a question which would elicit the response, the 4th floor, from whoever was working in the store. And he discovered that in the upper class store, people were more likely to pronounce the R. In the lower class store, people were less likely to pronounce the R. Was the R there at all? Well, apparently so, because when Leibov repeated the question, he was pretending to be a customer. While doing this, they would then pronounce it with a pronounced R, thus indicating that they knew the R was there. They were just choosing to drop it if their dialect demanded that. What to me is interesting is that it seems that although all 3 groups, upper, middle, and lower, knew the R was supposed to be there, only one group inserted it, if you like, while the other unconsciously dropped it. And it seems by corollary that the default pronunciation in New York is to drop the R, but people consciously reinsert the R if they want to add prestige, if they want to sound prestiged. Now, this connects very nicely with the section on hypercorrection on page 280. Now, you might hypercorrect by saying something like between you and I. That sounds grand, but it's actually grammatically wrong. You should be saying between you and me. But the problem about saying between you and me is it sounds a little less grand. So people put the I in because they think it sounds grander. Now, you'll often get this in pronunciation as well. People will insert R's to sound grander in New York English than they actually are. Although, in truth, the text leaves this open because it seems that R gets pronounced in certain situations. An R dropper in New York might still say something like India and Pakistan. Why is that R coming in? Well, all we can say right now, all we can hypothesize, is that although New Yorkers, particularly lower class New Yorkers, like to drop the R at the end of a word, they also don't like the glottal stop between vowels, between words, and they reinsert the R to avoid that glottal stop. So instead of saying India and Pakistan, they replaced that glottal stop with India and Pakistan. It flows better. So just a feature of that dialect. Now this brings us back to so-called correct English. Now I keep meeting people who either come from working class communities or perhaps African American communities who have been told time and again that they speak bad English or wrong English and that there's some sort of a correct or standard English that they should be speaking. This will particularly happen in classrooms, and lest you think that it is white people telling black people you should be speaking in the following manner, or rich people telling poor people you should be speaking in the following manner. A great deal of this hostility to working class English or African American English comes from within the communities themselves. So it isn't as straightforward as you might imagine. Now, I think it's indisputable that speaking what people feel to be standard English, and is all too often just white English or white middle class English, helps you get on. It does help you get on. But does that make that so-called standard English better? No. It just means that the dialect is less marked and you're less likely to draw attention to yourself in an interview for a job, for instance, by speaking the standard dialect, whatever it is. I'm somewhat hostile to the way linguists often offer abbreviations, SAE, ICE, to legitimize terms that to me aren't quite legitimate. So SAE is Standard American English. ICE is Inner City English. AAVE is African American Vernacular English. Now, while I will agree that AAVE exists, I'm a little more suspicious of things like SAE, Standard American English, or ICE, Inner City English. I think ICE is just a camouflage term for Black English. However, that's neither here nor there. Let's move quickly to the observation 2/3 of the way down, page 281, that the idea that SAE is the correct form of language is a social attitude, or more correctly, a language prejudice that is just as irrational as social prejudices involving race or gender. The so-called standard language is perhaps most widely identified with the educated white middle class. This is true. If you want to get on in the US, typically you try to sound like an educated white middle class person. Okay. Yeah, I'll just quote the sentence at the end of page 281 here. It's important to realize that labeling one particular dialect as standard and others as inferior is a socio-political judgment, not a linguistic judgment. There is nothing about African American English, for example, that makes it bad English. Now, that brings me very neatly on to the next section, ICE, Inner City English, and the verb be. 2/3 down, page 282, there are several examples where the verb be is deleted. She, the first one, started us off. He fast in everything he do. You out the game. We on tape. These are all examples of the verb be being taken out. Now, read carefully the discussion of this on page 282. It's not a random deletion of the verb to be. In fact, you can only delete the verb to be if in the so-called standard dialect you can contract it. So, for instance, you might have so-called standard English, she is the first one who started us off. And in so-called ICE, she, the first one, started us off. Now, recognize that you can say in the standard dialect, she's the first one who started us off. That is to say, you can contract she and is. But in situations where you cannot contract, let's see, can I find an example in a hurry? Yes. They're angry, that's what they are. Now, in that situation, can you contract they and are? They're angry, that's what they're. It fails. In fact, you can only contract at the start of the sentence. By the same token, you cannot delete the verb to be in inner city English or African American English. They're angry, that's what they. You have to put the verb in. The point here is that the deletion of the verb to be in African American English, or as the text keeps calling it, inner city English, is rules based. There are contexts in which you can delete the verb to be, but there are other contexts in which you cannot, and they follow specific rules. This is what encourages us to view African American English as a legitimate dialect of the English language, deserving as much respect as Australian English, Scottish English, Irish English, or any other dialect of English you care to mention. Now, let's observe also at the bottom of page 283 African American use of the be form of the verb to be. I get a ball, and then some children be on one team and some be on another team. Now, this is a very specific use of the verb be. I would call it something like the present customary. And I'm just inventing a word for this tense of English. And I'm inventing a word for it because there isn't really an acknowledged term for the way it's used in African American English. That is to say, there is a standalone tense. There's an entire tense in African American English that does not exist in the so-called standard dialect. You cannot say in African American English, he be my brother, because this present customary can only be used if it's an ongoing event that has a start and a finish. You can assume that that person over there is always going to be my brother, and therefore there isn't a start or a finish. All right. Now, a point that the text makes on page 284 is that we have language registers: formal, semi-formal, informal. Now, one feature that we tend to forget about African American English is it is almost entirely informal. African Americans have learned to use the African American dialect amongst themselves at home, on the streets, whatever, but never to use it in formal situations. So it is almost by its nature an informal dialect, whereas so-called standard English may have variations depending on the situation you find it. So-called standard English can be spoken informally on the streets, but then you might use a higher register of it in an interview or in a church service or in court, for example. And that connects very neatly to the section beginning at the top of page 284 on formal and informal language styles. Whether you know it or not, you change the way you speak depending on situation. If you're working behind the counter of a coffee shop, you're much more likely to say something like, "Would you care for some coffee?" or something like that, particularly if it's a high-class coffee shop. But if you're in the kitchen with some friends and you've just made a pot, you're probably just going to hold the pot up and say, "Coffee?" So you yourself vary your English according to who you're talking to and the situation, the expected situation. All right. Now let's move quickly on to section 7.2 here at the bottom of page 285. Some properties of the grammar of informal style in English. And again, one of the points here is that it's not random. You don't just say anything in informal dialects. You you speak according to certain rules. Just because you're speaking informal English doesn't mean you're speaking broken English or random English or anything like that. The section beginning on page 286, tag controls deletion, points to the ability of speakers to drop both the subject and the tense auxiliary verb in sentences. So you can say something like, been sneaking to the movies again, haven't you? Now, in a higher register, you would of course have to say something like, you have been sneaking off to the movies again, haven't you? Now, for some reason, you can drop the you have. But this is very rules based. You can't just drop you, for instance. It makes no sense to say, have been sneaking to the movies again, haven't you? That's illegitimate. Even removing have sounds a bit strange. You been sneaking to the movies again, haven't you? Because of the tag, and note that in the tag, the auxiliary is repeated and the subject is there too. You have to remove both the auxiliary and the subject in the main part of the sentence as well. Now, there are several examples of where that fails to happen in section 11 and 12 on page 287. You see the asterisks there mean these are never said and can't be said. The point here is that deletion like this occurs according to very specific rules. Native speakers learn these rules as they learn their native languages, but they might not even know that because they're picking up these rules subconsciously. Section 14 on page 288 is a description of those rules. The subject of the main sentence may be deleted under the following conditions. Number one, there's a tag. And number two, if the main sentence contains an auxiliary, it must be contracted onto the subject if it can be contracted onto the subject. So that's a fairly complicated rule, and yet every native speaker of English knows that rule simply through observing the speakers around them. The section beginning at the bottom of page 288 is a variant of that, I feel, so I don't see any need to spend much time on this. You can say things like running a fever, finally rich now, your car in the garage, and all you're doing is deleting the verb to be. So that's all I have to say about that. I'm going to move on. The third section here, beginning page 290, deletion and recoverability of information, I think is a variant again of what we were talking about above in deletion of the verb to be. Take a look at the top of page 291 here. It basically spells out what I've just said. It appears that native speakers of English, as they learn how to form abbreviated questions, come to learn the specific elements that can be missing from these questions. That is to say, practice makes perfect. You know what can be deleted through constant repetition of sentences like this, and you're therefore able to recover the information that's supposedly not there. The subsection beginning page 291 is a restatement of that, basically. There are rules for African American English, and they are followed, and there are similar rules in other dialects of English as well. The section beginning 292 simply observes that dialects are more than simply pronunciation. So if I were to read a, I'm just going to see, can I, is there one on my shelf here? There isn't. If I were to read a legal document in a Texan drawl, it would just sound strange. It wouldn't sound necessarily Texan, because there is more to Texas English than simply pronouncing things as Texans do. A genuine dialect has pronunciation features, that is to say, phonetic features. It has morphological features, which is to say the words change according to certain rules. It has syntactic features, which means the shapes of the sentences change according to certain rules. And it has pragmatic features, which means that what's implied by utterances in that dialect is changes from place to place. So in Cockney English spoken by working class people in London, for instance, you might you might introduce somebody to somebody by saying, "This, my very good friend John here." Now, only a Cockney would know that that's actually kind of code for saying, "I don't know this guy at all." If you were to say that in other dialects, you would. It would be implied that this person is indeed your very good friend. So what's implied by utterances can change from dialect to dialect. Right, let's move away from English alone. Section 7.3, beginning 293, deals with other languages or versions of other languages. The first concept introduced here on page 294 is lingua franca. It might surprise you to learn that 80 or 90% of speakers of English around the world are not native speakers of English. So, for instance, I know scores of people from India who speak remarkably good English. But India has almost no native speakers of English. These are people who learned English at school and from the television and from the radio. And often when it comes to specific idiomatic use of English, they're at sea. They have no idea what's being said because they don't have idiomatic control of the language in the same way that native speakers do. Yet, probably somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people in the world have some control, some understanding of English, and might use that English for business and commerce. We're going to call languages that are used for common business, etc., linguae francae, that is to say, comes from the term lingua franca, originally meaning language of the Franks, because that was the standard Latin in the Middle Ages. The text here argues that it's a variety of Italian with a smattering of French and Spanish and so on. Could be that too. In any case, a lingua franca is an agreed upon language that you who speak Danish and I who speak French, so that we can communicate with each other. It might surprise you to learn, for instance, that somewhere just less than 1% of the population of the EU speaks English. And yet the most commonly spoken language in the EU Parliament is English. What's happened here is that most EU residents have learned English as a second language at school, and it's a handy second language to use in multicultural situations like Parliament, the EU Parliament. Now, I want to move on to what happens in contact situations. Now, the text might have made things easier talking about pigeons by talking about slavery. As you probably know, the United States permitted slavery until the center of the 19th century. And it was only really after the Civil War in the United States that slavery ended. Now, let's say that I'm a slave owner in, let's say, Alabama. And I own 30 slaves. So I have a largish plantation. Where have I got my slaves from? Well, it's highly unlikely that those 30 slaves all come from the same cultural background. They probably all come from different tribes somewhere around the West African area. So they're not going to be able to talk to each other in their own languages. So how will they communicate with each other? They're probably going to use my language, because English, if it's English, is the language of operations in my plantation. Now, they're going to talk to each other in English, but obviously they're only going to have a very limited grasp of English. They're going to have the basics of word order, the basics of pronunciation, and the basics of vocabulary. As is mentioned here, you can have a perfectly functioning pidgin with vocabularies of 500 words, which is tiny. Pidgin simply means an agreed upon third language. Kind of means lingua franca if you think about it. Now, what if those 30 slaves intermarry and have children? What language are the kids going to speak? The likelihood is that those kids are going to speak some version of the pidgin that the two parents are speaking together and that the slaves on the plantation are speaking together. But now that pidgin has native speakers. The next generation of slaves are now using the pidgin English to communicate amongst themselves. And we're going to stop calling that a pidgin now and call it a Creole. So that's what the difference between pidgin and Creole is. Pidgin does not have native speakers, Creole does. Many of you will be aware of the word Creole if you have connections to Haiti or Jamaica. Creole is a commonly used word in the Caribbean area. Right. There's an interesting, but in the end, tangential, discussion of features of Creoles from Australia and elsewhere on pages 297 to 300, no, 299 in fact. For instance, how English Creoles seem to frequently use been as a marker of past tense. Let's kind of think of any other examples in a hurry. Probably not. And there's a good discussion there on page 299 of the terminology of pidgins and Creoles. Page 300, jargon. Jargon is basically the specific vocabulary you in your community use for activity specialized communication. You may find yourself hearing nurses and doctors talking to each other using a very specialized vocabulary for the drugs and the equipment around them. Computer technicians will have their own specialized vocabulary. Even criminals have their own specialized vocabulary. We use the word jargon to describe these subsets of English. Now, what's the difference between jargon and slang? Well, in the end, I think I'll just I'll tell you that jargon can be used formally. Slang is never used formally. Slang is such an ambiguous term that I'm not sure it should be used anyway. However, you were once a teenager. Some of you may still be teenagers, and you probably developed your own vocabulary to set yourselves off from older people. 20 years from now, the words you are using at the moment will sound hopelessly old-fashioned. I quite like the terms that the text provides at the bottom of page 301. In the year 2000, lame-o was a common word for somebody who was weird or somebody who was unsuccessful. In the year 2010, supposedly a postal is used to describe that sort of person. I don't know about that. But slang, almost by definition, goes out of fashion very quickly. Yeah. There's an interesting section on page 305 about code switching. Now, if you speak another language at home, you probably engage in a bit of code switching yourself. You might throw in an English term when you can't readily think of a Spanish term, for instance, or you might throw in a Spanish term when it seems more applicable. We drove to Passaic last week to see my tia. It might seem strange to call her anything other than your tia. There's an odd example halfway down page 385 of a vaguely Hispanic radio station in Arizona using sentences like, it's now 8:30. It sounds strange, but seems to work. Code switching happens, and I think that's all really that section of the text says. And I agree. So that covers chapter 7, language variation. I hope my discussion of it here helped, and that we will have a fruitful discussion of this chapter later on. So I'll sign off now, and I wish you all a good day.